Today is second APWF webinar, and we kindly invite Mr. Howard Bamsey, Chair of Global Water Partnership. Mr. Howard Bamsey will deliver climate change, sustainable development, and investors more risk, more opportunity through better governance. Prior to start our APWF webinar, I firstly would like to introduce how to use Zoom application form when you ask question during the Q&A time. I think you will find the raise hand button. If you like to ask question during Q&A, please click raise hand button. While the raise hand icon is active, our secretariat will acknowledge your request. We also welcome your question in Q&A box. So we are very looking forward to your interaction with us. Now, I would like to welcome our APWF Governing Council Chair, Mr. Ravi Narayanan, to deliver his opening remarks. He will also be taking the role of the facilitating role during the Q&A. Now, Ravi, thank you. Now, floor is for yours.
Thank you very, very much, Yumiko. And may I add my greetings to that of Yumiko and welcome you all to the second in the series of webinars that we are planning in the run-up to the 4th Asia Pacific Water Summit. We have today a very distinguished speaker, Mr. Howard Bamsey, who is the chair of the Global Water Partnership. And he's an honorary professor in the School of Regulation and Global Governance at the Australian National University. He's a member of the board of the Climate Change Initiative and Climate Works Australia. And he was previously the executive director of the Green Climate Fund and Director General of the Global Green Growth Institute. Earlier, he was Australia's Special Envoy on Climate Change, and he was a senior Australian public servant. He's held several appointments at ambassadorial level in the Australian Foreign Service, and Mr. Bamsey was educated at the University of Queensland at the Harvard Business School. We couldn't have asked for a better speaker on this complex and intriguing subject of climate change and sustainable development. So I'd like to invite Mr. Bamsey. He's going to put up his slides on the screen. So over to you, Howard.
Thanks very much indeed, Ravi. I'll just put my slides up, and climate change is an intriguing and complex subject, and it's often framed, I think, in very complicated ways. And although it's a bit of a complicated story, I think there's a fairly simple logic to what we need to do to deal with the threat of climate change. And you start with the notion that it is something that's caused by what we do as human beings, by economic activity. And therefore, the solution lies in the hands of human beings in changing our economic activity from the sort of thing that causes the problem to the sort of thing that fixes it. And if we want to change the direction of economic activity, we need to fix investment. So, in a word, there is a solution to climate change, and it's investment. And I just want to tell the story of how changes in global governance and domestic governance in different countries and different places can make a serious contribution to solving the climate problem by enabling that change of investment that we require. It is a very risky period for all sorts of reasons that weren't apparent, all of them, at the time that this survey was done by the World Economic Forum. But as you can see, there are 3 of the top 5 risks that you could associate with climate change: 1, 2, and 5. And we know what the impacts of climate change are. We're seeing them in different parts of the world now. with a vengeance. This is a list of some of the changes, and as a result of gradual perception of these risks, we came together in Paris in 2015 for, I won't go into the details, but this was quite a remarkable meeting, and it helped establish positions for governments making commitments which are important, but not the real answer to dealing with climate change. But the theory that was manifested in the Paris Agreement was this, that if you want a starting point, then it sits with the commitment of the developed world to mobilize $100 billion a year, every year from 2020, that would play a key role in shifting investment patterns around the world and in moving investment, climate finance from hundreds of billions to trillions. And it's important, I suppose, at this point, just to make the obvious, to make the obvious point that the world is not short of money. It's one thing we have plenty of, but we won't solve climate change unless we get it going to the right place. And as a result, this started to happen before Paris, of course. Paris is one of the manifestations of the gradual perception of the climate threat, but we started to see all around the world attention paid by governments to the need to change the regulatory framework to encourage, in effect, to encourage changes in investment patterns. And there's been a lot of climate change legislation and regulation around the world. And you can see it occurs in all sorts of places that might not immediately come to mind as places which are leading the response to the climate challenge. And I said earlier that improving governance was one of the really effective ways to encourage that change in direction of investment. And in the financial system, improvements to governance have taken place. They began way back in the early 90s with initiatives like this one, the UNEP Finance Initiative, which I see I've spelt wrongly there. And since then, a range of other actions to improve transparency, to identify the climate risks that companies and investors face, because until they're identified, until they're fully transparent, they can't be dealt with effectively. And then in 2015, with Mark Carney and Mike Bloomberg pushing hard, the FSB established the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. And just a couple of weeks ago, New Zealand legislated to make the disclosure of climate risk mandatory for companies. So we're starting to see a hardening of the governance around transparency of climate risk. And that's beginning to play through in different ways. We now have a network of central banks, and that really counts, and that's beginning to be really effective, I think, in changing the financial structures and the incentive structures in different countries to encourage greener investment. Securities commissions are becoming part of the act, and the multilateral banks too are responding to the need to be seen to be doing more. These numbers don't mean quite what you might think at first glance, but it's a sign that financial institutions around the world are beginning to respond to this hardening of climate-related governance. The carbon market is an important part of the financial system, not at this point playing the sort of role that most people had hoped, but it will come back and eventually will play, I think, a full role in dealing with climate change, because until we recognise in the economy the cost of carbon and other climate change emissions, we will not change the pattern of investment sufficiently to deal with the problem. And at the moment, in too many places, it's still an externality. It hasn't been integrated into the economy. Divestment has been another response. Another response to the climate challenge. And you could say at this stage, it's maybe not quite yet mainstream, but just earlier today, I saw a tweet from Rachel Kite, who has a long career at the World Bank and is now at the Fletcher School as Dean. And she mentioned in the tweet that she'd been told repeatedly by funds managers that they would never in themselves refuse to make investments in fossil fuels. And she noted that a couple of these funds managers are doing so. So perhaps we've passed the tipping point at which divestment, using the term loosely, is something that was undertaken only by these sorts of organisations we have listed here, and is becoming more mainstream. The only point to make about renewables as part of the climate change response is to look at the direction of those lines. They go down, they're crashing. The cost of renewables is reducing even faster than anybody predicted. And that continues. Green bonds are a part of this emerging climate governance in the financial system. It's another strand of activity. It's suffered this year because of COVID, but I think is expected to come back strongly next year. Climate finance has been gradually increasing. There was a peak in 2017, which makes it look like 2018 saw a problem, but in fact, the trend is steadily upwards, and the Climate Policy Initiative, which tracks climate finance pretty well, expects that trend to continue. Part of the response to climate, which is intended to deal with a different set of risks. We started talking about the physical risks of climate change and the financial risks of climate change, but there are other risks, because as we respond and as the direction of investment changes, investors understand that to deal with climate change, they have to move to new geographies, new technologies, and start making changes to their own investment patterns. But they perceive all sorts of risks which they haven't needed to confront before. In developing countries where the sorts of financial governance arrangements that they expect are sometimes not available, in the risks for investment in new instruments, new financial instruments, all of these which are necessary if we're going to see investment change in the way we need. All of these are seen by many conservative investors as just too hard to deal with. And the Green Climate Fund was one of the global responses to help change this investment paradigm and to ensure that the sorts of aspirations that developing countries have for climate finance could be met. And indeed, the GCF, I think, has already had an impact. We're beginning to see it make provisions for climate finance which other institutions would not do, and by that form of intervention to encourage more conservative investors to reach out and deal with the manifest challenges to responding to climate change in developing countries. As I showed in this slide, just simply understanding what your climate future is very difficult for developing countries, for most developing countries, in fact. And so this sort of project that we see in Vanuatu, improving climate services, is vital. And the GCF has taken an important step with the World Meteorological Organization in bringing this sort of solution, this improvement in understanding climate risk and for at a country level to many more countries. The GCF is also helping countries be even more ambitious in their attempt to deal with climate change. So we're starting to see some change in the pattern of climate finance globally, in which we see, and Climate Policy Initiative has made this clear, we see an increasing proportion of climate finance in the developing world. And that's really vital if we're going to deal with climate. So there is a change already to investment, but it's not sufficient. And it is not always reflecting the really pressing needs of developing countries. And as you can see here, scaling up adaptation is, we know, one of the real priorities for developing countries. And if you look at this analysis of the nationally determined contributions that countries took to the Paris meeting, you can see that pretty much every developing country and some developed countries prioritized adaptation in their nationally determined contributions. And here we come to one of the central roles of water, because if you think about adaptation, in other words, responding in an effective way to the physical impacts of climate change so that the people, the society and the economy of countries are resilient to those impacts and spring back, anticipate and spring back, then water is really central, because water is almost always the first casualty of climate change. It's also the means of conveying the impacts of climate impacts to other parts of the economy, for example, to agriculture, to public health. And this is a very complicated picture of, in Spanish, of how that happens and why. But essentially it's because everything about our water resources changes, and usually adversely, with climate change. So if we're going to deal effectively with climate change, and if we're going to respond to the priorities of developing countries, then improving water governance and our management of water and water security is really vital. So this is where the GWP becomes relevant for these reasons. It has global reach with 3,000 partner organisations in over 180 countries, with country water partnerships and regional water partnerships. And it has a unique convening power, so that when decisions on allocation of water, on how we deal with and manage our water resources have to be made, all the stakeholders can be brought together, and decisions which may not be one-off, but may be a continuing process, can be organised in a robust manner. And that's all about governance. Partnership is vital to the way GWP works, and partnership is a key aspect of good governance, because it's a way of ensuring that the needs of all users are balanced and understood and integrated into decision-making processes. So we can hope that with the changes in governance in the financial system, with the ongoing efforts to change that still further, with the recognition of the need to deal with perceived risks in new areas, and the design of new instruments to help us deal with those perceived risks, with the establishment of new organisations such as the Green Climate Fund, with a mandate to change the paradigm, we can hope that the investment pattern globally will begin to change. And perhaps the highest point of hope is when we look at what young people are thinking about as they begin to accumulate more wealth and think about their own investment future. And we can see here that young people are pretty inclined, just of their own volition, to change the direction of investment so that over time we will see the investment pattern change radically. The big question, and the question that I would love to answer with conviction and in a positive way, the big question is this happening quickly enough? But I think if we're being honest, we would have to conclude that at present it is not happening quickly enough. There is momentum, that's certainly the case. There is greater momentum at present, I think, in the business world than in government. And I think we have a real chance of changing that investment, but acceleration is really vital. And if we want to accelerate the pattern of the change in the pattern of investment, then making our governance internationally and domestically even more robust is the best way to do it. Thank you.
Ravi is unmuted.
Yeah, sorry. Thank you very much, Howard. That was a very good a very comprehensive overall picture of the issues. Do we now have two short videos? One from GWP Southeast Asia on the issue of partnership that Howard talked about, that Mr. Bamsey talked about. And the other one is on youth engagement from the Asian Development Bank, which also Mr. Bamsey talked about. So shall we play those now before we go to the Q&A? Thank you.
While there are many headlines about Asia and the Pacific's aging population, it's actually the most youthful region in the world, with over 1.1 billion people aged under 30, accounting for more than 50% of the region population. With the need to empower young people in the region meaningfully clearly identified, the Youth for Asia initiative was founded in 2013 by the Asian Development Bank with the mission of enabling governments to collaborate with young minds to develop the Asia and the Pacific of their dreams. So how does Youth for Asia support young people to contribute to solving financing and governance challenges on water-related issues on the ground? We promote youth-leading cross-generational and multi-stakeholders approaches across development projects in Asia and the Pacific. And it is also our role to leverage funding sources from ADB to pilot and collect evidence to build a stronger case about how young people can be partners for a prosperous, inclusive, resilient, and sustainable Asia and the Pacific. Our first experience was with the Coral Triangle Initiative across 3 island countries, including the Solomon Islands, Papua New Guinea, and Timor-Leste. Through the trainer-trainer activities in marine resource management, young people empower local citizens to be active contributors in their communities. Participant leaders organize monthly community cleanups, appointed conservation committees, and develop management plans for the conservation sites after the training. Learning from the success of the Coral Triangle Initiative, the next youth-led pilot and demonstration under the Bamsey River Basin Improvement Project between ADB and Nepal government aims to bring evidence that how young people can lead the cross-sectoral and multi-stakeholder approach for community engagement to tackle 3R principles of reduce, reuse, and recycle waste. Young people have a chance to host dialogues with their national and local government representatives, sharing their vision and action for the future of the Bamsey River. And with the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, the pilot is also testing the effectiveness of hosting community engagement activities virtually. Last but not least, we are also working with the local city government in Chilean City, People's Republic of China, under an ADB project about ecological improvement in Songhua River to encourage young entrepreneurs to create green solutions to improve the environment and also the livelihood in the area. The chosen innovative solutions will be further supported financially by the government. And additionally, young people will have the chance to interact with their communities and promote sustainable living and practices for the Songhua River. From all our past experience and research, here's what we found out about young people which might be very interesting for you. Young people are digital geeks. Young people are innovative and disruptive thinkers. Young people are caring and responsible citizens. Young people is a resilient and resourceful generation. We are natural collaborators and we are behavioral influencers. And what young people can offer that to bring insights, where we call it the generation of knowledge and research. We bring voices where we lead advocacy for creating sustainable change. And we bring action where we co-design and implement and evaluate development activities. Most importantly, we should not work alone. We need to work with you and with different generations. Building cross-generational partnerships is a must to enable active and meaningful contributions of young people for sustainable development progress.
Thank you very much. So we've had a very interesting keynote by Mr. Bamsey, followed by 2 short videos, which seem to point out to the fact that the road to SDG 6, which is water security, can only happen if it passes through SDG 17, which is collaboration and cooperation. There's no other way. So now there are some questions and answers that will be directed to Mr. Bamsey. One of them is complementary to the thing that I was going to ask myself. And that is from Mr. Deepak Gyavali from Nepal, and he says, is the geographical emphasis of action on climate change largely confined to Europe and North America, which seem to have, well, maybe not North America, but Europe certainly, rather than the developing countries who need to develop their fossil, or who seem to be racing to develop their fossil fuel usage in terms of transportation and energy. So have we got the geographical balance right, Howard? That's the first question.
Well, look, I think there are many ways of responding to that question, but the most obvious is that this is changing rapidly. I mentioned earlier that Climate Policy Initiative, which tracks the climate finance globally, a few years ago, only a very few years ago, maybe 4 or 5, made the point that most climate finance in the world was within the developed world. So in other words, it was generated in the developed world and it was invested in the developed world, and that has now changed quite dramatically just in the last few years. And we're now seeing much more finance invested in the developing world. Much of it is still coming from the developed world, but also with the sorts of initiatives that, for example, the Green Climate Fund is taking to encourage institutions in the developing world to improve their governance and compete, in effect, with the big institutions of the developed world and with the multilateral banks, which otherwise do indeed crowd out institutions from developing countries. Then with those changes, I think we are beginning to see a change in the balance. It's not going to be an overnight phenomenon, but it is actually occurring quite rapidly. Now, if you stand back and look at the totals at the moment, you will see a much faster change in investment in developing countries than you will see in the generation of finance in developing countries. But that is starting to change rapidly as well. And so I think the balance is not right, but it is changing. And I think developing countries, the second part of the question, developing countries are increasingly seeing that their development will not be fossil fuel led, and that there are new pathways that enable them, just as they did with telephone technology, to leap over old pathways and adopt new ones. And again, I think we see some of the more innovative investments from the multilateral world as leading the way, and the comments by President Xi Jinping just a week or two ago that China would aim for carbon neutrality by 2060, I think can only encourage that movement.
Thank you very much, Howard. I have a couple of questions, more fundamental questions. You know, when we talk about climate change and you talked about threats and opportunities, is there a geographical division between countries that are going to be benefited from climate change and countries that are going to suffer from climate change? Apart from the extreme climatic events, for instance, is precipitation going to increase in some arid areas so that their agriculture can flourish? Temperature is going to be dropped in extreme areas so that their growing season can improve, etc., etc.
This is a complicated story, and I'm not a climate scientist, so I can't respond authoritatively. But as I understand the picture, there could be some marginal benefit in some places. I mean, the most obvious is that increasing levels of carbon dioxide for a very short time will help with increasing crop yields, all other things staying equal. But of course, other things don't stay equal. And one of the impacts of increasing carbon dioxide concentrations is very often that if you live or you're farming in an arid area, that area will become more arid. And so you can have all the carbon dioxide you like, but your crops are not going to increase in their yields. So it's a very complicated story. I mean, another obvious point, I suppose, that people often cite is that in places like Russia and Canada, that as things warm up, you'll be able to extend agriculture. But in places like Canada and Russia, as things warm up, the whole infrastructure that depends on permafrost will start to degrade and enormous costs will ensue. So I don't think there's anywhere where, at least I've never seen, anywhere identified as a net beneficiary of climate change. And what we generally expect, and climate scientists will pull their hair out when they hear me say this, but I think what we generally expect is what you have, you'll get more of with climate change. So if you get floods now, you're going to have more severe floods. If you have cyclones now, the cyclones will get worse. And if you live in arid areas now, don't expect any more precipitation, by and large. It'll be very different in different places, but the picture is not encouraging for any country, I think.
Thank you very much. So a pretty bleak future as far as climate change is concerned. Just a question on the balance of investment between mitigation to a focus towards mitigation or adaptation. Is it generally true that international funds are more directed towards mitigation, whereas country funds towards adaptation? And is the balance about right, do you think?
That's a very interesting question, and it's one that has a real world dimension, and that's the one you've addressed. But there's also a political dimension, and that's been on display in different international forums. What I think is the case is that, well, there are a couple of points, factual points, I suppose, to be made. If you look at in climate finance generally, most of it is seen to be going into mitigation, particularly into renewables, because the business case for investment in renewables is just a lay down misère. I mean, it's so increasingly attractive in almost every place that everybody's getting into the act. And so that's one trend that's very important. But as I tried to show in my presentation, climate change is having a substantial and really serious impact on water resources. And that's being compounded by all sorts of other flow-on effects, so to speak. So there's an urgent case for adaptation. If you look at the portfolio, the adaptation portfolio of financing institutions, most of it's about water. It might be labelled agriculture, but it's really about how you manage water more effectively to improve agriculture. And so the adaptation story is very largely a story about water. And we haven't seen the sort of investments in adaptation that you might expect if you're talking about the management of water. And this has always puzzled me. And I wonder why there are so many companies, for example, that make their livelihoods in the water, in managing water or helping local governments and utilities to manage water. Why don't we see more investment? Why don't we see insurance companies who, as soon as there's a cyclone or a drought or a flood, have to deal immediately with responding to the needs for of water infrastructure which have been degraded or knocked out, why don't they anticipate these problems more and invest more in water? So yes, there's certainly not enough being invested in adaptation and in water in particular, but the picture's a bit also a bit obscure. The Climate Policy Initiative published some research in November last year or October, which showed that many climate activities that were identified as mitigation also had important adaptation benefits. So it is a complicated picture. I don't think the balance is yet right. In the Green Climate Fund, which was specifically mandated to balance its water, that's a Freudian slip, its adaptation and its mitigation investments, then you can see that depending on the metrics you use, that is being achieved. So I think we're beginning to see more interest by investors in adaptation, but it's still not there. The common excuse, and I think of it as an excuse because I don't think it's really very valid, is that mitigation leads, there are really obvious business cases that lead to profits in mitigation activity, and not so many business cases that lead to profits in adaptation. I think that's to some extent a failure of imagination. And I think if you look at, again, some of the leading edge investments of the Green Climate Fund, for example, in collaboration with Acumen, a not-for-profit investment fund based in New York, you'll see that there are ways in which you can invest in adaptation activities and expect to see profits emerge, and indeed expect to see industries expand and agriculture expand. So yes, it's complicated yet again, but and there's not enough investment yet in adaptation, so the balance is not quite right. But I think, again, we're seeing some understanding that there is a future for investment in climate adaptation, and that's largely a story about water.
Thank you very much, Hart. And are there things that developing countries can do to reduce the risk to private investors?
Yes, well, I think where they have the capacity, and that there are many indicators of capacity, where they have the capacity, then specifically seeking to improve financial governance is probably the best thing they can do. In many cases, though, they don't have sufficient capacity to be able to do that successfully. And there are all sorts of reasons why that's the case. And what we've spoken about for many years as the sort of wonder drug to fix that problem was blended finance. So if you go to any sort of international meeting and you're talking about investment in development generally, but certainly in climate, you'll hear people mumbling about the future of blended finance. And they've been doing that for a long time. And indeed, that blending between public and private is, critical and has been successful, but it's not really there yet in the volumes that we expect. And improving governance in the destination for investment is the fastest way to accelerate that blended finance, but it can have a role in any case. What I think would help in the absence of improved governance is financial innovation, and we don't really see enough of that. I think investors, are often said to be conservative. It's not just that they're worried about losing their money, it's that they're conservative and their advisors are conservative in devising the correct instrument to deal with the problem. For example, I'll try to be a bit careful here. We talked about being guarded before. I won't be too pointed, but in one part of the world where there is a very, very strong business case for renewables, because they would be displacing very expensive fossil fuels. What we've seen is multilateral funds and banks have been dealing with the promise and the difficulties of renewables investment by subsidizing them, by finding ways to subsidize them. That's had the impact of crowding out the private sector, because the structure of investment doesn't generate profits. And it's frankly wasted a lot of money. What is needed in those places, I think, in the particular place I'm thinking of, is different financial instruments which might deal with the risks that private investors perceive, which are not really that the investment won't generate a return. They're really different sorts of risks, often sovereign risks, and they're not dealt with properly by subsidies. So what I think developing countries can do is call on their sources of finance to be more innovative and to deal with and respect the problems, the individual problems of individual countries. Not to walk in with an off-the-shelf solution conceived in some global financial center and to expect that that will work in every country, because we've seen so many times, not on climate finance alone, but right in the whole development story, that has failed us. And unless we deal with individual circumstances in the way we devise our support, then we're not going to fix the problem. So what developing countries can do, I think, to answer that question really directly, is first do everything they can to improve governance for investment and financial governance generally. And second, encourage those who are supporting them and providing assistance to use their imaginations, to go off and ditch the usual things that come off the shelf and think carefully about the circumstances that they face in their countries.
Thank you. Yeah, this could be a contentious area, of course, because, you know, public perceptions being what they are, there could be a perception that public risk and private profit, you know, the government bears the risk and the private operators make the profit.
Yes. Yes, that is contentious. And I think many people in many places are leery of that moral hazard, if you like, for both sides. There are ways of dealing with it. And I think, again, it can be instructive to look at particular projects and how they're constructed. But it is about, at the end of the day, it's about risk tolerance, and probably the highest tolerance for risk is to be found in philanthropic foundations, where the objective for investment is all about impact rather than about profit. Then you move down a bit to public institutions where the primary objective is about impact, but you are safeguarding the taxpayers' funding. And finally, you could move to the private sector, where the primary objective has to be about profit, but where in some cases anyway, you're now beginning to see much more interest in impact. So I think that's, you know, there is a hierarchy of risk tolerance there that just is part of the real world, and we have to understand it and use it, I think. to benefit development.
So I suppose it's a question of a step-by-step process and a graded response backed by good regulation and capacity.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Okay. One final question, Had. You know, there's been a lot of discussion on an energy revolution, right? Solar power, wind power. I mean, the British Prime Minister said that every house in Britain is going to be powered by wind power, et cetera, solar power and so on. Is there not sufficient discussion about a water revolution though? You know, has the energy revolution captured the public discourse rather than a water revolution?
I'm afraid that's the case. Excuse me. I think there are different reasons. One of them being that, well, I think what is it that's happening? And I think what you're talking about is a gradual decline in the interest of government and public, to be frank, and investors in the need for a water resolution to solve the multiple crises in water, because we're seeing newer problems crowd out that question, and the newer ones also have more obvious solutions. And you've talked about energy, where you have these dramatic debates and dramatic changes have occurred. So yes, I think there is a gradual decline in interest. Another reason I think is that globally we have conventions, global conventions that focus attention on the particular problem. For example, the Climate Convention. Now, you and I were talking earlier before we began the webinar about the focus on meetings and commitments on the one hand. That does help spur action and focus attention of the media and governments and people on the issue. Water doesn't have a global centre in the way that climate does, for example. So yes, I think we've got a serious problem to deal with. And I think one of the other factors that compounds that problem is that the water world is so fragmented. We have so many organisations that overlap, that face in the same direction or different directions, saying the same things repeatedly to one another, but not sufficiently yet beyond the dimension of the water world.
That's a serious issue that needs to be dealt with if we are to make progress in terms of water. Howard, I'd just like to thank you very much. If I may just try, it's going to be very difficult to try and capture all this in a couple of sentences, but what you seem to be saying is progress is being made. Perhaps it's not quick enough, but in making the progress, we need to be very careful about the specific circumstances in which one issue or the other has to be addressed, and the solutions have to be tailored to those circumstances. Otherwise, you're going to get it wrong. So no silver bullets or magic bullets or anything like that. It's going to be painstaking, hard work, and issue by issue and a country by country approach.
Exactly.
I think that's kind of, you've covered a very wide set of issues and circumstances. And the other one that you're saying is, which is very important from a water point of view, is water organizations need to get their act together if they are to make a global impact in terms of the issues of water security, because there are too many of them and they're running on parallel tracks rather than a convergent track.
Exactly.
So those are some of the issues. So I'm now going, this is just to thank Mr. Bamsey, Howard Bamsey, for his very insightful remarks and comments and presentations. And please join me in thanking him for that. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Ravi. Thank you, colleagues.
And now I think I'll turn to Yumiko for some closing remarks, and she's got an important announcement to make. Yumiko?
Yes, okay, thank you. Thank you so much for Mr. Howard Bamsey for very informative presentation and response to the very various challenging issues coming from Ravi. Now we receive several questions in Q&A box, and we also show some raise hand. But because of the time limit, we couldn't respond within this 1 hour. But Mr. Howard Bamsey will kindly respond to your question. So please wait for a moment for his response. Thank you so much. And I thank you so much for Mr. Bamsey and Ravi for very interesting and very important discussion to assist us for understanding various complicated issues, but necessary for solving the challenge for sustainable and resilient future. Thank you so much. Now, yes. It will be great if Mr. Howard can kindly deliver your final remarks and takeaway message to us.
Well, thanks very much, Yumiko. I think they were summed up very well indeed by Ravi. We have to deal with the risks of climate change, and the way to do that is through changing the pattern of investment, and that means that we have to deal with a different set of risks, and the way in which we deal with them has to be very responsive to particular circumstances that affect countries differently. And secondly, that water is the center of climate adaptation and resilience, that if we're going to deal adequately with climate change, water has to be very much in focus, and yet it's started to slip out of focus. And one way of ensuring that it receives the attention that's required is for the whole universe of water organizations to become much more coherent and to join their voices more effectively beyond the water dimension and with the wider community where water really matters.
Thank you very much, Howard.
Thank you so much. And I also thank you for all listeners to join our APWF webinar. I thank you. Now I would like to conclude the second APWF webinar. Then finally, I would like to introduce our third APWF webinar. Our third APWF webinar will be organized in 10th November, 1:30 to 2:30 in Japanese time. The speaker will be Professor Shabat Khan. He is the director of UNESCO Regional Science Bureau for Asia and the Pacific. He is also taking the role of the direction of the representative to Brunei, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, and Timor-Leste. He will deliver about the water, science, education, and the importance of investment. The detail will be sent to you later by email. I would like to ask you to save the date for this 10th November for the third APWF webinar. Thank you so much for your support to our APWF activity. And finally, I would like to introduce the new date of the fourth APWS. New date of the fourth APWS will be 23rd and 24th of April in 2022.
That is the Asia Pacific Water Summit.
Yes, that will be held in Kumamoto City in Japan. We will do our continuous effort to prepare the very valuable summit to improve water security and also the response to the SDG 6 in Asia Pacific. Your contribution and your interaction with us is very important through this APWF webinar, as well as our preparation of the fourth APWS. Thank you so much.